We have Gustaf Lundin joining us today. He is the principal scientist at the IUCN Global Marine and Polar Program. He's been diving all over the world for decades, so I can only imagine the amazing things that he's seen and he's documented. I'm probably gonna get a little jealous as a diver myself as I'm watching this presentation, because he's gonna give us a little sense of marine biodiversity around the globe, but emphasizing coral reefs and our polar regions. So I do want to point out to those tuning in live, there's Slido rooms for every one of these events. You can send your questions into those Slido rooms. You can find those on the speaker page under their bios, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a discussion with Carl at the end. All right, that's enough from me, Carl. We're excited to dive in with you and see some of the amazing marine biodiversity you have to share with us.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with all the viewers around the world. So I must say I have had a fantastic opportunity to go around in many parts of the world and do all kinds of extraordinary things. And what I thought I'd share with you is a few of the highlights of some of the things I've been doing. So actually this screen itself gives you a little bit of some of the cases. Diving with bull sharks in Fiji was certainly an exhilarating experience. And I think we had 40 or so of them at the time. I've done it a few times, and it is very well run. It's also run by Fijians, which is really nice to see. You know, everyone loves a nice beach, but I must say Cook Islands has some of the most extraordinary places in the world. And of course, Antarctica is without parallel, I think, for all of us, a dream. And I've been lucky enough to make a couple of visits out there. So I thought I'd cover mainly some of the wonders of marine biodiversity and give people a little bit of a sense of what's out there. Then I thought I'd say a little bit about marine protected areas and a couple of words about oceans and climate and what we're facing in terms of the oceans. So just so you understand who I am, I come from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I was running the marine and polar program there for many years, and now I've stepped over to be the principal marine and polar scientist, which really gives you an opportunity to work a little bit closer to science and see conservation at work all across the globe. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of how active this program is. We have been working in all major seas around the world. Of course, very different levels. And as always with IUCN, we try to work closely with our partners and our members. So it's very much focused on the ability of local people to improve the way they manage, be they governments, be they non-governmental organizations, in some cases businesses and the universities as well. Now, for most of us, we think about the ocean as like these places we fly over when we try to get between continents. And at this point, I guess no one's not even doing that. So it's easy to forget the ocean. But in fact, it is a very large part of where things live on this planet. It's as much as 95% of this ocean surface actually has very deep volumes. And that's where most of the ocean is. And that's the areas below 200 meters. And that is all the dark blue parts on this map you see below. Now, what does that actually imply? Well, it is a very large body of water, 97% of all the water we have on this planet. And we all know that water is a precious resource, but it is also in the ocean quite a precious resource, and it's easy to miss that point. It also is where 80% of the global biodiversity resides. And I think a lot of people miss this point, that so much of it is actually where biodiversity is. So I hope we have 80% of the presentations here being about the ocean, because that's actually where the stuff is happening, right? Now, the other thing, of course, is it's full of different types of life forms, and some of them are very tiny, down from viruses all the way up to some giant animals. So I thought I'd start with the phytoplankton, which forms the basis for pretty much everything that feeds in the ocean, everything that's alive. And in some ways, I think, is also the type of systems where we can see dangerous algal blooms. We can see various types of events that are impacting us. So most of us are sort of waking up to the idea that even at the level of phytoplankton, we're sometimes doing damage to this planet, and we need to improve the way we do things. Now, zooplankton tends to live off a lot of the phytoplankton. And here, the striking thing is lots of things in the ocean start out as zooplankton, and that's how they get going. And then they gradually grow into something much bigger. And that is quite thrilling when you think of it, how extraordinary life forms, and they can go through complete body transformations that make them look truly like aliens at some stage in this process of evolving into something which is an adult animal. Some of them actually sort of stay in stages which look like they were subadults, and that's as far as an evolution kicked in. As we go into the coral reefs, and here I've been very lucky to spend a lot of time working on coral reef conservation, I think we find all kinds of other interesting things also. Many groups, many types of relationships, symbiotic relationships, or where they're codependent on each other one way or another. And I think studying those is very rewarding because it gives you a sense of how wondrous nature is and how complex it can be, and how little we actually know in the greater context. So for those of you who are younger, I think this is an opportunity perhaps to learn also about nature and the way it works. And there's still an enormous amount to be explored. So don't be shy. Take the opportunity to go to study marine biology, and I think you'll never regret it. I've certainly been super lucky to pick this area of work. Now, as we look at other types of animals, there's very striking how many different types of life forms and phyla there are out in the ocean. And for most of us who live on land, it's really hard to relate to them because they don't actually exist on land mostly. And that is the hard sort of crust to get your head around. How did this come about? I mean, how could so many different things evolve in such a complex way and such intricate systems? But I think that's the wonder. That's what's so exciting about it. And that's what gives us a chance to learn so much more under this gaze of understanding biodiversity. Personally, I'm happy to celebrate tomorrow World Turtle Day. You might know that turtle conservation is something that many of us feel has been neglected or marginalized. We've seen so much of the habitat of the turtles be destroyed over the years, be it through destruction of the beaches themselves or light pollution or other forms of pollution, and of course then direct killing of turtles as well, which is done in many places. I was lucky to start my conservation on turtles in Seychelles, which is an island nation in the Indian Ocean, which has fabulous beaches, but many of them had very few turtles at the time we started. But it is a true conservation success story, largely down to a handful of people spearheaded by a woman called Jeannie Mortimer. I think they've done a fantastic job of actually turning the curve and getting young children involved in turtle conservation. And that's really tipped the balance in the direction of seeing the populations of both the green turtles and the hawksbills recover. I think it's a good model of where we can show also that the value of a live turtle is so much greater than the value of a dead turtle. Traditionally, this was eaten quite extensively, which is understandable when you have a small population of people and a lot of turtles. But we quickly got to a situation where we had a growing population and fewer turtles, and you really can't continue to sustain that kind of consumption. So with the outlawing of the use of turtles, I think we really turned a corner. Things started to get much better. And now in many places, they've been completely protected for several decades. And that really makes a huge difference because they do need time to bounce back, but eventually they will. But these are migrating animals. And of course, there are other places outside of the protected zones where they are being killed one way or another directly. And that is impacting them. And with shifts in the climate as well, we might also see local effects that really impact them. Looking at another reptile being sea snakes, I think that's the type of animal that most of us are a little bit scared when we see. I was just recently in Indonesia before the lockdown diving, and we saw sea snakes pretty much all the time. Of course, they are some of the most venomous animals that we know of, but they're very docile and not at all aggressive towards humans. So I never felt scared, even coming face to face with one on a night dive, just swimming up to me. I didn't sense that this was really something that presented any danger. And I think if you behave like a responsible diver, it's very unlikely you'll have any problem with the sea snake. But sea snakes, I think, are the types of animals that are good indicators on the health of the system and the diversity, and the fact that we really need to conserve it to maintain them. If we don't, we tend to lose them quickly. Whereas mollusks like octopus or squid, for example, tend to be fast reproducing. They're in that sense easier to deal with. from a management perspective because it's harder to destroy the populations, even if we're doing our hell-bent best to do so in a number of places. So I would say whenever you're out there and you happen to see an octopus, these are remarkably intelligent animals, and it's actually so much fun watching them and how they behave and so on. And we saw some blue-ringed octopus on this last dive trip, and again, quite a poisonous animal, but by and large, very non-aggressive. And you know, if you behave rightly, they actually behave in a very interesting way towards you also. Now, here are a few fish that we are seeing huge declines of. In the left-hand corner, you can see what is often referred to as a Napoleon wrasse or a humphead wrasse. This animal has been overutilized and killed very extensively in many parts of the world. One of the main reasons for this is because it's easy to serve in big wedding banquets and so on. It's a big fish that serves quite a few people. Also with its rather peculiar look. Some people find the idea of eating these lips particularly alluring, and just the lips can cost hundreds of dollars to have served in a dish. Frankly, as far as I'm told, it tastes like any other type of slime, so it's not really that exciting, but for some people, you know, it does come across as something very exciting. Looking at groupers, pretty much everywhere we go on reefs, we see decline in groupers, and the main reason for that is, you know, they're relatively aggressive carnivores, and they tend to be easy to fish out. Also, they tend to have mass spawnings, many of these species, which means if you know when they're going to reproduce, you can go in and kill off all of them before they have a chance to reproduce. And that's happened in many places, and these mass spawning events aren't happening as much as they used to be. So just a couple of examples. And for many of us, I think looking at open ocean species, this is perhaps the easiest and for many people, the only way to see them, which is looking at them in an aquarium. Now, I just want to say a couple of words about aquarium, because some of us have a strong view that aquarium are not a good way of understanding the ocean and the wonders of the ocean. I tend to more practical view, which I think is, as long as you can treat the animals well and make sure they have enough space to move around, it is still very rewarding, and particularly for children, to have an opportunity to actually learn about things and directly relate to animals. And I think it serves a very important function in terms of education. Without direct observation from humans, you're much more detached from biodiversity, and you actually end up not bonding in the right way. And so from my perspective, I think aquariums do serve a very important role. And I think a lot of us delight in having the opportunity to see them. Having said that, here are a number of species which I don't think belong in an aquarium because they need much larger ranges. And in fact, the great white, for example, would end up dying in many cases if you would put them in an aquarium. So they really can't cope with this in a meaningful way. Whereas other types of animals are sometimes kept in large aquarium, like the orcas. But again, my sense, or dolphins, my sense is we shouldn't be doing that. It really, they're too intelligent. These animals really suffer, and it's not a good thing to have them roam around in the way, in a small space that you would have to have in order to keep them captive. So think about it when you go to visit one of these sea parks next time, and talk to the people who are actually running it and say, you know, we appreciate the education opportunity, but we also don't think you should have everything locked up that doesn't belong in an aquarium. And of course, as we get to some of the real giants out there in the ocean, the idea of putting a blue whale in an aquarium, I don't think has occurred yet, and that's a very good thing and shouldn't happen. Humpbacks require generally very large migrations. And of course, again, it would be a really fatal thing to do. As we start to learn a lot more about some of these creatures and their way of communicating, I think one of the things that's always intrigued me is the ability of some whales to actually have 3 conversations at the same time. So they can have a close conversation, which is either with in terms of behavior and in terms of something that they can observe with the members of their group. And then they can have a sort of a shorter distance sound communication, and then a long distance communication. So thinking of it as humans, it's perhaps as, you know, we are on our computer at the same time we're actually doing a texting on our phone, and at the same time we can actually talk to someone, and they're able to do these 3 conversations at the same time. Personally, I find it really hard to do 3 things at the same time, but that just tells you how smart some of these animals are and how incredibly large brains they have in order to have the capacity to do so. Yet we know practically nothing about all these aspects of communication and how they master this. And, you know, trying to do that, I think, is another fantastic research project for young explorers and scientists of the future. Now, at the bottom, we have the two largest fish, the basking shark and the whale shark. And of course, most of us have heard of whale sharks, but when you have an opportunity to swim with them, which I also did about a couple of months ago, it is a really remarkable thing. And on a couple of occasions, they actually swam up to me straight in my face. And, you know, I'm a big guy, but even me, I felt like, well, I could have been accidentally mistaken for something that could slip down there. And so you do have to be respectful also when it comes to these animals. Again, I think some places we love them to death because we've developed tourism that's very intensive and I think is in some ways also disturbing the behavior of the animals. With the basking shark, I think that's maybe less prevalent, largely because of where they occur and how they like to be in rather murky water. So it's less attractive for people to spend a lot of time there. Plus, they tend to be in much colder waters, which again would turn a lot of people off. So 80% of global biodiversity is in the ocean. And of course, when it comes to discovery, we still have so much to do. And I think that's another wonder here. We have an ability to really learn and explore this planet of ours in completely new ways. And I think we're also, through a crisis like this, finding out there are ways of learning which you can do remotely, where you are actually not necessarily there, but we have remote operated vehicles. We have all kinds of ways of observing things, and you can be part of this journey of exploration. Now, why are the oceans so special? Well, the oceans had a $2.5 billion head start on evolution. So we actually have twice as many phyla, big groups of organisms in the ocean as compared on land. So, you know, there's just very many different types of life forms, and some of them are really particular and peculiar. And that's what I thought I'd say a couple of words on. And one of the reasons for that is the oceans are very big and they contain lots of nooks and crannies and interesting type of systems. And some of them are very peculiar that you only find them in a few places on the planet, but they still pretty much all have different types of life. So life has an ability to finding its own niche, even under very extreme conditions. So here's a couple of examples of corals, and they, just to illustrate that they can really look very differently depending where you are. My favorite is the one in the center top there, which was in a mangrove forest, which I had a privilege to swim on just a few weeks ago. And again, the amount of richness and species, I think, is just extraordinary when you stick your head into the water. And this is just like 1 meter under the water. Mangroves, we all love when it comes to conservation. And as IUCN, we worked a lot on mangrove conservation across the globe. High seas, also full of marine life. Perhaps in some places, the number of species is a little bit less, and you find some species in very wide distribution, also species that have large migratory patterns. And we're finding out more and more about this, and it, I think, is a fascinating story. We also have these new types of systems that we didn't know only 50 years ago, like the underwater geysers. And these are full of very peculiar animals that don't depend on the energy coming from the sun, but come from what comes from within the crust of Earth. And that's also quite a different type of system. So sinking to new depths, going down to the bottom of the ocean, we actually have some really extraordinary life forms. And I must say, I've always found the mesopelagic and then down to the abyss being one of the most fascinating parts of the planet. And again, few people have the opportunity to actually go down there, but increasingly we can observe these animals in their own habitat through the development of various new tools. Now, finally, saying a couple of words about the polar seas also. Up in the right-hand corner, you see a flying penguin, just to dispel the myth that they can't fly. That one I took myself in Antarctica a few years ago. But there's also lots of other types of marine life in the polar regions that have learned to adapt to these rather harsh conditions. Now we're seeing very quick climate change things happening in the ocean. and particularly in the polar regions. So just to illustrate how fragile the ocean is, I told you it was vast, but in fact, this is all the water there is on the planet. It's a sphere with about 1,200 kilometers that contains all the water. Now, that makes it more understandable what we're doing in terms of shifting this ocean. And this is to illustrate where all the heat that comes from our burning of fossil fuels have ended up. So the red line is what's in the atmosphere, and that's on a daily basis what we're thinking about when we're talking about climate and what's happening with the weather. The green part is what's residing on land. That's where we live. The part which is in the ice is the gray line there. And then you basically have the deep and the upper ocean. And that's where the vast majority of all the energy, maybe as much as 93% or so of what's in the ocean, has ended up heating up this area, particularly the upper layers of the ocean. And this transformation of these systems has had dramatic effects, lots of different places. And it does beg the question, how do we cope with this? So just to round up to say, we work very hard on marine protected areas as one of the tools to do this. We've seen a steady increase of marine protected areas around the world. This gives you a little bit of a sense of where we have them now. The good news is that we've gone up to maybe 7.5% by now, but most of that isn't really properly protected. And we are seeing a system that is degrading in many places. So we still have a lot of work to do, but that's also an exciting challenge, I think, for all of us. So just to conclude, I think we're seeing an unprecedented change in the ocean all over the place. The good news is we know there are solutions that actually will work. We know that turning the tide is going to take time, but we are able to do it. And my organization and many others that were members of ours and not are able to actually help and do some great things here. Thank you very much.
All right, Carl, thanks so much. Oh, very cool. I like that little ending piece. Awesome. Hopefully no one was too close to the TV on that one. Carl, I'll get you to stop the screen share and come back to us. We get you nice and front and center for a little Q&A action. There we go. All right, good to see you. Amazing presentation. Thanks so much for sharing with us some of that amazing biodiversity across the planet and making the point that 80% of it is found within our oceans, and we should be paying a lot closer attention. So we have questions that have already come in, lots of questions that have come in via Slido for you. So I'm so glad everybody's found those rooms and are starting to use the Slido rooms more. And the top voted question right now is from Santino, and they're curious about how deep, what's the deepest dive you've ever done?
So I've actually never been in a submersible, and that's very difficult for me to have to admit, given that I'm on the board of Sylvia Earle's Mission Blue, which is all about building subs. And I think she's talking later this weekend, so you'll have an opportunity to listen to her firsthand. So I've actually only done scuba type of diving, and I think I've been down to 47 meters. So, still deep, but not in the range of anything reckless, let's put it that way.
Yeah, roughly 150 feet for anybody who needed to do a quick conversion there. Very cool. Our next question coming in, Sophia is really curious about, you've traveled the world, you've seen so many sea creatures. Can you even pick a favorite? Do you have a favorite?
So I was asked this question a couple of years ago at the Natural History Museum, and I picked the sea urchin. And the reason for that is my father did sea urchin research when I was a kid. And so I ended up helping him with that research, and that got me a strong affinity. Also, I think as creatures, they tend not to get the cuddly effect that a lot of other things are. So people love dolphins or sea turtles and so on, and so do I. But I do find sea urchins particularly interesting.
All right, very cool. So Natasha's got a really interesting question here. She's saying, we see a lot about how COVID-19, the lockdown, is having an impact on the behavior of animals on land, terrestrial species. Has there been much observed in the ocean so far?
Because very few of us have an opportunity to actually go out there right now. And unfortunately, some of the people are out there are perhaps doing so illegally because there's less enforcement. Now, I think that would probably be more in coastal regions where they're able to sneak out without being detected if they're in remote areas. And of course, you had some of the distant fishing fleet that was already out there and that didn't want to come back because their country was now hugely affected. So some of those workers had to spend months at sea and longer than they perhaps had bargained for. Now, having said that, it's very hard to assess right now. My assumption is that in some places we had significant poaching going on and sort of illegal fishing. In other places, we're clearly seeing a downturn in the demand for seafood, which might then trigger people spending, less money or less interest to actually buy, exotic seafood. So I think it works in both ways, and it'll depend really on the country and the tradition and how well people are observing the lockdown.
All right. We have Alicia tuning in. Alicia's 9 years old, and she'd really like to know, Carl, how you chose your career. What made you interested in it?
So as I think I alluded to, I was very lucky. My father brought me to all these marine biological stations. When I was her age exactly, I did a tour of all the marine biological stations of France, which to me was a great eye-opener. I went to the Museum Monaco, for example, the Oceanographic Museum, where Jacques Cousteau was the head of it. For those of you who might not know about him, he was the one who developed the aqualung to deep dive. I also had the opportunity to visit a number of different places and meet many of the scientists. My father was very generous with bringing me along all these times. So that really was an eye-opener. And then I spent many summers at one of our marine biological stations on the Swedish west coast where I grew up, and extraordinary experiences there also. So that pretty much triggered an interest that stayed with me my whole life.
All right, we can definitely squeeze one more question in here. So great to see so many questions coming in via the Slido room. It's almost hard to pick. But let's see, I like this one here. So how do you think, what do you think we should be doing differently to assess or to monitor illegal fishing? So like of the hump-headed wrasse or shark finning, what do you think is something we should be doing differently globally?
So we're getting better and better to actually track the fishing industry. One of the ways we have is satellite tracking. So either you put a transmitter on the ship, and that is then constantly telling people where they are and often what they're doing. But you can also use, for example, radar satellites, and then you will see what is on the surface. So pretty much everyone who fishes actually have a boat and they're on the surface. You're not going to fish from a submersible. So, you can observe things on the surface. The other thing is to have the good actors in the industry rat on the people who are behaving illegally, so that we encourage self-policing within the industry. And I think that's another way of moving forward. And then I think we need to have much tougher penalties. I mean, countries like Malaysia, for example, burn all the ships that are caught illegally fishing. Well, at least it means they won't go out fishing again with that boat, and if you do that consistently, you actually can lower pressure and you send the right signals to the different parties that, this is a crime. Every year we're talking about maybe $8 or more billion of theft. Now, if anyone went in and robbed a bank of $8 billion, we would all hear about it. But because it happens here and there in the ocean, we sort of let people get away with it. And that has to stop.
Okay, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for those tuning in for the great questions. We're going to keep this broadcast running live, so stay tuned. Our next event with Peter Houlihan is we're just going to go right into it. I'm going to let our new host in and go for it. Carl, I want to give you a huge shout out. Thank you for sharing some expertise with us, sharing some amazing marine diversity from around the world, and being a part of this Global Biodiversity Festival. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you today.
Thank you so much, Joe. My pleasure. It's great fun. And I would encourage all the young people to go out and study marine biology and jump and plunge into it. It's definitely a career worthwhile.
All right. Again, thanks so much, Carl.